The movie opens in a diner, where there's blood everywhere, and multiple dead bodies are seen. A terrified man calls 911 and informs the operator about the massacre that has taken place. He claims his friend Nancy is dying, and when the operator asks for his name, he responds that it's Jake Collins. The scene then cuts to 24 hours earlier, where we see our protagonist, Nancy, peeing in a field. She then returns to her car and stares at a pregnancy test, which shows a positive result. Later, Nancy meets up with her best friend, Tabitha, and shares the news. Tabitha asks who the father is, but Nancy casually replies she doesn't know, as she's been with multiple guys recently. She adds that she'll probably get rid of the baby, because if her dad finds out, he's going to kill her. Afterward, Nancy is heading to work in her waitress uniform, when her car suddenly breaks down. Since she can't fix it herself, she has no choice but to walk the rest of the way. Nancy soon comes across a guy named Bobby, who also works with her. She tells him she's running late, because the manager needs to arrive earlier than the others. Bobby thus offers her a ride on his bicycle and the two of them head together to work. Soon enough, they arrive at a diner, where Nancy meets her dad, Edward, who turns out to be the owner of the place. He scolds her for being late, reminding her that she's now a manager. He also informs her that she must work the late-night shift tonight with another employee named Jake. Nancy argues that she finds Jake to be a weirdo, and requests her dad to at least let Bobby stay. However, Edward states that he can't afford to pay Bobby overtime, and insists that Jake is his most trusted employee, leaving Nancy frustrated. Later, Nancy starts working in a grumpy mood, and she tells Bobby that she has to work the late-night shift with Jake. Hearing this, Bobby offers to stay, even though they won't pay him. It's clear he's romantically interested in Nancy, but she doesn't seem to pay him much attention. Suddenly, Nancy feels nauseous, so she rushes to the back of the diner and starts throwing up. Jake, who is the chef, notices her situation and asks if she's pregnant. Before Nancy can answer, Edward arrives and demands to know why she is vomiting. Jake quickly explains that it's because of some rotten meat he accidentally left in the fridge. Following this, Jake wishes the boss good luck with his big date tonight. In the afternoon, a staff member named Pete accidentally spills some water on the floor and apologizes, but Nancy reassures him that it's fine. She then notices some troublesome teenagers arriving on their mopeds outside and causing a disturbance. She immediately goes to scold them, but the boys insult her, and even throw a dead animal at her. A furious Nancy demands that they leave, and then enters the diner, where she almost tumbles on the slippery floor. She harshly scolds Pete for not cleaning it up yet, and he apologizes. But Jake, who's Pete's brother, asks Nancy to leave him alone, since Pete isn't like others, and has Down syndrome. Moments later, things get worse when the teenagers enter the diner wearing creepy masks. Nancy asks them to leave, but they insist that she serve them, and even place the dead animal on the table. And so, Nancy calls the cops and informs them of the situation. But Jake notices that the call isn't connected, and she's just bluffing. Regardless, the scared teenagers finally proceed to leave, but one of them promises Nancy that he will come back later. Afterward, Nancy gathers all the employees, including Bobby, Pete, Jake, his close friend, Coop, and another guy. She reminds them that although she's younger, she is their manager, and they must respect her decisions. However, Jake doesn't take her seriously, and claims she's only the manager because her dad is the owner. The comment enrages Nancy so much that she abruptly informs Jake that he's fired. Shocked, Jake argues that she can't make such a decision, but Nancy demands that he leave. Jake eventually has no choice but to comply and walk out. Afterward, Bobby keeps checking on Nancy to make sure she's okay, and even offers to stay the late-night shift with her now that Jake is gone. But Nancy becomes irritated with him and states that while he's a good guy, he will never be able to be with her. She rudely curses at him in front of the customers. In the evening, the day shift ends, and all the employees except Nancy head home. She says goodbye to Bobby, but he's still upset about earlier. Soon, it becomes dark, and Nancy is left all alone to work in the diner. She calls her dad and informs him that she has fired Jake for giving her attitude. Edward isn't happy to hear this, and tells her he'll deal with the situation tomorrow. After the call, Nancy starts playing loud music and turns on the disco lights. She begins dancing and having fun without a care in the world. Unbeknownst to her, someone is standing outside and watching her. Suddenly, Nancy feels nauseous again and ends up making a mess on the floor. Later, while she's mopping the floor, someone begins banging on the walls of the diner, and it's the same masked teenagers from earlier. Nancy warns them over the speaker and threatens to call the cops on them again. But this time, the threat doesn't work. Terrified, Nancy quickly locks the door and calls 911 for real. She frantically explains the situation, but the operator informs her that all units are busy and they'll send someone as soon as possible. This doesn't sit well with Nancy, and to make matters worse, the call is abruptly disconnected. To her horror, the teenagers get more aggressive and try to force their way in. Nancy grabs a knife for protection, and while trying to hide, she comes across the animal carcass she had thrown earlier, and the lights also cut off, sending Nancy into a state of panic. She desperately searches for her phone in her bag, but can't find it. We then see someone approaching her from behind, right when police sirens are heard. Next, Nancy lets a sheriff inside, and frantically describes how she was terrorized by a group of teenagers who even cut the electricity. But when the sheriff turns on a switch, the lights come back on. He then thoroughly inspects the area, but can't find anyone around. The sheriff calls the station and informs them that some kids were terrorizing Nancy, but they fled as soon as he arrived. He now plans to stay for a while to make sure the girl is safe. Afterward, Nancy serves the sheriff coffee, but she's annoyed by his carefree attitude and his perverted eyes. She again explains how the teenagers came on mopeds and were constantly banging on her windows. Upon hearing mopeds, the sheriff finally becomes worried, and immediately takes her outside to put her in his car. Here he informs her that he just came from witnessing the most brutal murders he's ever seen, and the culprits were seen fleeing on mopeds. And then suddenly... Go, go, go! Nancy quickly runs away from there and locks herself inside the storage room of the diner. From there, she witnesses one of the teenagers brutally beating the sheriff. Nancy also spots one of the masked figures lurking outside the window, which scares the shit out of her. But moments later, Bobby appears unexpectedly outside the diner, so Nancy rushes over and quickly brings him inside. She uses his phone and tries to call her dad, but Edward doesn't pick up. Just then, the troublemakers come in, so the two proceed to hide in the kitchen. Unfortunately, Bobby makes an accidental noise, which alerts the attackers. He begins running away, so Nancy also goes back into hiding. She texts Tabitha from Bobby's phone and requests that she urgently come to the diner. But then all of a sudden, a masked guy finds her, and it turns out they have also captured Bobby. They tie both of their hands with duct tape and force them to kiss each other. Nancy refuses to cooperate, so one of the guys takes her to the back room to punish her. He begins sniffing her like a weirdo, but this gives Nancy the opportunity to free herself, and she stabs the guy before fleeing the diner. Outside, Nancy comes across another masked figure and stabs him directly in the abdomen. But in a shocking twist, the man turns out to be Pete. Moreover, the other masked people, including Bobby, rush outside to help him, and another one removes his mask, revealing that he is co-op. Nancy is horrified to learn that the people who have been terrorizing her are none other than her employees. The movie then flashes back to right after Jake got fired by Nancy. He pleads with her not to fire him, saying he has bills to pay and medical prescriptions. But Nancy doesn't care and says he should have thought about that before insulting her. Jake is enraged by this, but he has no choice but to leave the diner. We then see him frustrated in his car, unable to refill his prescriptions because he hasn't paid his bills for 3 months. Jake contacts his relatives for money, but they also refuse to lend him anything. After Pete's shift ends, he and Jake head home, and they soon stop at a drug dealer's place. The dealer refuses to hand over the drugs without payment, but Jake shows him a gun and forces him to comply. On the way home, Jake gets high and tells Pete that drugs help him cope with the trauma he has experienced throughout his life. He also mentions that he had big plans for the diner and was about to discuss them with Edward. But now, he can't believe Nancy had the nerve to fire him so easily. Not long after, Jake notices the troublemaker teens gathered around a bonfire and urges Pete to stop the car. The brothers approach the gang, who recognize them from the diner. Jake reveals that he doesn't work there anymore and begins casually chatting with the teens. But the conversation takes a different turn when he begins blaming them for getting him fired today. One of the boys tries to get aggressive, but Jake immediately stabs him in the gut. He then pulls out his gun and forces the remaining troublemakers to get on their knees. Next, Jake gives the gun to Pete and orders him to shoot them if they move. He then plays loud country music and forces the teenagers to dance like idiots. They seem reluctant and try to argue, so Jake asks his brother to shoot one of the boys. When Pete hesitates, Jake pulls the trigger himself, only to discover he is out of bullets. An enraged Jake then attacks the boy and chokes him to death. In the aftermath, we see Pete crying in the car, so Jake scolds him and blames him for what happened. He then kicks Pete out and gives him a mask, ordering him to wait for him at the diner. In another scene, Coop and Bobby are drinking together, and the latter expresses his feelings for Nancy. At this moment, Jake arrives wearing a mask and scares them. He then shows them the mopeds and suggests going on a ride. When the others ask where he got them, Jake explains that he and Pete stole them from the troublesome teenagers. Meanwhile, Pete arrives at the diner and notices Nancy talking to her dad on the phone. Jake, on the other hand, gives his friends the creepy masks, claiming he has an idea. Soon enough, the three arrive at the diner and meet up with Pete. They start terrorizing Nancy by banging on the windows and walls.
Really scared.
When they notice her calling the cops, Bobby suggests maybe they should stop the prank, as Nancy seems genuinely scared. But Jake insists that she is faking it again, and he turns off the lights to scare her even more. When the sheriff shows up, the group quickly retreats and hides in the storage room. Jake then orders Coop and Pete to take the moped to the other side of the diner and wait for his signal to rev the vehicle. They oblige, and we see the worried sheriff trying to put Nancy into his car. At this time, Coop revs the moped, which Jake uses as a distraction to attack the officer. Nancy then runs away, while Jake begins hitting the sheriff multiple times until he's dead. Upon seeing this, Bobby has had enough, so he takes off his mask and pretends to have just arrived on his bicycle. Nancy takes him inside, while Coop is shocked that they just killed a cop. But Jake says he did it for Coop, since his fingerprints were all over the place. He then urges him to find and kill Nancy and Bobby, or they will all go to jail. In the present, Nancy can't believe why her own employees would torment her like this. The guys begin tending to the injured Pete, so Nancy takes this moment to walk away from them unnoticed. Her attention is then shifted to the rotten meat from that morning in the trash can. Inside the diner, Jake demands that Coop find Nancy if he doesn't want to go to prison. Bobby then notices the sheriff's car keys on the countertop, and he suddenly attacks Jake. Elsewhere, Edward leaves a voicemail for Jake, saying he heard what happened. He asks Jake not to mind Nancy and assures him that he will always have a job at the diner. On the other hand, Coop finds Nancy in the kitchen and tries to attack her, but she pushes him toward the deep fryer and then knocks him unconscious before running away. Later, we see that Jake has overpowered Bobby and fatally stabbed him. He enters the kitchen and tries to wake up Coop, but it's clear the guy is already dead. Nancy, on the other hand, spots Bobby lying in a pool of blood, and with his last breath, he weakly tries to hand her the car keys. All of a sudden, Tabitha shows up at the diner, but seeing the massacre, she gets horrified and immediately leaves. Nancy takes this moment to run downstairs, and Jake also follows her. But when he arrives at the office downstairs, Nancy is nowhere to be found. And then suddenly, Nancy tries to leave the diner, but unfortunately, Jake again shows up and stabs her in the back. We see that it's already morning.
Jake drags her inside and repeatedly strikes her in the abdomen.
He then puts a sticker badge on her. Up next, while driving home, Jake calls the cops to report the massacre in the diner, but leaves out the fact that he was the perpetrator. Meanwhile, in the diner, it turns out that Nancy is still alive, and she pulls the knife out of her. To add, we also notice that she had wrapped the rotten meat around her body as a protective barrier. This protected her to some extent, although she's severely wounded. She crawls up to Bobby's body and grieves for him for a brief moment. Nancy then takes the sheriff's car keys and drives away at full speed. In another scene, Jake returns home and begins calling for Pete,
despite knowing he isn't there. He then decides to flee the town and begins packing his clothes. Outside, Nancy weakly gets out of the car with a knife and begins searching for him. Jake then hears the doorbell ring and grabs a hammer just in case. He carefully opens the door, but can't find anyone, and the doorbell keeps ringing. Here Jake discovers Nancy's badge on the door.
And then this happens. Nancy, who had sneaked in through the back door, brutally stabs him in the neck. The girl then pulls out the knife, leaving him to bleed to death. Shortly after, we see that Nancy has grown too weak to continue walking. She collapses on the side of the road to rest and recalls her conversation with Tabitha. She reveals how she feels stuck in life despite just turning 20. She wanted to do so much in life, but now she's pregnant and can't find meaning in anything. In the final scene, Nancy is found by her distraught dad, who assures her that help will arrive soon. Nancy attempts to speak, and the injured girl only manages to mutter, "My baby," before the movie comes to an end. Thus, we reach the end of this movie. Thanks for watching. If you like the movie, support us. Don't forget to subscribe for more movie recaps. See you in the next movie. Goodbye.